Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here for another episode of Lab and Learn with Reed Davis and Dr. Aaron Gonshore, where we go over some labs that are very, very useful in sorting out what's really wrong with the person. Not looking so much to diagnose and treat disease, but to just help that person understand why they feel so terrible and what they can do about it. That's the nature of FDN. And this is our foundational sort of flagship test. We've already gone over some major portions of the test, the cortisol to DHEA. We know the person's in a catabolic state. We know that that is from stress, basically, and that now their sex hormones have fallen apart. And not to mention the fact that their immune system is being affected. And so you get a really big, broad picture of a person, their adaptive reserve, and it really helps an FDN practitioner assess. Here's what you can do. Now, there's other labs for other days, but now Dr. Gonshore is going to go over the last marker for this test, insulin. And Dr. Gonshore, I'm just going to let you take it from there.
Well, thanks, Reed. Thanks for having me again. And hello to everyone. I'm just going to get our show on the road. And as Reed said, we are looking here at what we call part 3 of our advanced stress and hormone profile. And today we're going to be looking at the metabolic profile, which is the 5th part of all of this, looking at insulin, both fasting and non-fasting. And as Reed had mentioned, we'd already gone through the first 4, looking at a stress profile, meaning the adrenal function, the sex hormones, melatonin, which, just to remind you again, is a major antioxidant. That's actually its major function. And of course, close by that, its function in circadian rhythm control. We also went through mucosal immune action. In other words, secretory IgA, the immunoglobulin that makes its home in the mucosa of the intestine and other mucosal surfaces of the body. And today, we're going to be looking at the metabolic profile, as I said, insulin, fasting, and non-fasting. And you see this here at the bottom of a typical report. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just to acquaint everyone again with insulin, where it's produced, etc. And so you see the title of this slide is Islets of Langerhans of the Pancreas. And the islets of Langerhans is an area of the pancreas where the beta or islet cells are living. You see them here schematically in gray, that grayish area. These are irregularly shaped patches, and that is endocrine tissue located within the pancreas. And those islet cells produce insulin. And insulin is crucial in a whole number of metabolic processes. Most importantly, it promotes glucose uptake by the cells and their metabolism. At the same time, it prevents glucose from being released in the liver. We're going to go over that in a minute. It also promotes amino acid uptake by the muscle cells. So amino acids, as you remember, are the building blocks of proteins. And so it is also involved in protein metabolism and as well lipids, fat. It inhibits the breakdown of lipids and their release. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. And so the summary of that would be, as far as the biosynthesis, insulin is a peptide hormone and it's secreted from the beta cells. 50 or 60% of it is extracted by the liver before it even reaches the systemic circulation. And it has a half-life which is very, very short, actually, 4 minutes. A half-life means the half time that it takes for a particular protein, lipid, whatever it is, hormone, to be completely eliminated by the body. So that means if its half-life is 4 minutes, within a 10 or 15-minute period, etc., it is eliminated from the body. So it actually has a very short acting time. Insulin has an anabolic function, which, if you remember, that promotes various things such as glucose uptake, glyconeogenesis, the creation of various types of glycogen products and other carbohydrates. It's lipogenetic, the creation of lipids, protein synthesis in the skeletal muscles and in fat tissue. So remember, it is an anabolic hormone, and its most important function is regulating the plasma glucose, the blood glucose homeostasis. And what does it do? It actually counteracts glucagon and other catabolic hormones such as epinephrine, the glucocorticoids, the various types of steroids, and growth hormone. So, just to remind everyone the way it works, after a meal, blood glucose immediately increases. Insulin gets released very quickly from the pancreas. And what does it do? It stimulates the uptake and the storage of glucose in fat cells, muscle cells, the liver, and that is in the form of glycogen. And in that way, it removes it from the blood. So insulin is allowing glucose to enter cells and the liver, etc., and it gets it out of the blood. Several hours after that meal, blood glucose drops. It has dropped. It's in the cells now. So what happens? Glucose levels in the blood are dropping. There is a sense of that dropping. And what happens? Glucagon then gets released from the pancreas and it stimulates the liver to break down glycogen, which is stored in the liver. It breaks it down into glucose and it actually synthesizes new glucose. And that is released into the blood. And what does all that do? It normalizes those glucose levels again. So all of this is happening to keep glucose levels in a normal range in blood. But what happens when that doesn't function the way it should? And so we're going to spend a couple of minutes looking at insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. So what is insulin resistance? Well, originally, it was a survival advantage. And even today, in certain societies, in certain situations, in the time of food insufficiency, and even when you're getting into a possible starvation, what the body does is the blood glucose, that uptake from the muscles is reduced because normally you want glucose to go into the muscles so you can function normally. But when you're in a state of possible starvation, it gets shunted. That glucose gets shunted to the brain, either for immediate use or to store whatever can be stored in the fat for future needs. And so the body knows when there is tremendous insufficiency, you've got to protect the brain. That is the most important thing. But today, we see insulin resistance in many people who are not in an insufficient food state or starvation. Physically, what would you see as signs and symptoms of insulin resistance? Some classic ones: increased thirst, increased appetite. You want to get food in there, and weight gain because people keep on eating for various reasons, which we will go into later. And so there's weight gain. At the same time, there's frequent urination, there's fatigue, there's blurred vision, and metabolically, what you're getting is high blood pressure, high cholesterol levels, and high levels of triglycerides. At the same time, low HDL, the good cholesterol, goes down, and there's an increased risk of blood clots. So these people can get strokes much more easily. All of this is really discussing the problem in modern societies throughout the world, and that is obesity. And it's called, in effect, a modern fat storage condition that has gone out of optimal and is now in an excess state. And what these people are suffering from is what is known as metabolic syndrome. And what is metabolic syndrome? It's insulin resistance, which we just discussed a moment ago. The cells become resistant to bringing glucose into the cells. So there's an elevated fasting glucose in blood and in saliva as well. Normally, there shouldn't be. But when you have metabolic syndrome, the glucose is elevated, so are the triglycerides. In fact, you have what's called hyperlipidemia, high levels of fat in the blood. Blood pressure is elevated, low HDL cholesterol, it's dyslipidemia, and you get central obesity. That means increased levels of fat in the abdominal area. And what does that lead to? It leads to hypertension, chronic kidney disease, fatty liver, cirrhosis, type 2 diabetes, etc. So if you're looking at what metabolic syndrome can cause, it increases the risk for cardiovascular, kidney, liver disease, stroke. Remember, I talked to you just a few moments ago about increased clotting. Diabetes goes up, sleep apnea increases, so does levels of Alzheimer's and cancer. Metabolic syndrome is seen in greater than 30% of US adults. And this is absolutely disastrous, greater than 50% of those who are over the age of 60. In fact, 80% or more of the US population, I would say North American population, have at least one component of this metabolic syndrome, of these things that we just discussed a moment ago. So it is a major issue within modern society. And what it leads to, in many cases, is diabetes. Now, in 2013, worldwide, there were 380 odd, let's say 400 million people with diabetes. It is forecast that in 10 years from now, we are going to be at around 600 million. That's well over a 50% change over really a 20-year period, which is uh, remarkable. It's very hard to even try to contemplate these numbers, and one has to ask, why is that happening? However, we do know that early diagnosis, on-time treatment, and continuous management really becomes vital to a patient's quality of life. And as I said a few moments ago, to avoid the complications of cardiovascular disease, kidney failure, disease and failure, stroke, blindness, etc. Just a reminder, what is type 1 diabetes? Type 1 diabetes, the pancreas is failing to produce enough insulin. The beta cells just aren't producing it, or they're not even active in the pancreas. And so glucose is sitting in the blood, but the channels that are required to open to allow glucose in, which are controlled by insulin, are closed. This differs from type 2, where the pancreas is producing insulin, the glucose is in the blood with the insulin, but the cells have become insulin resistant. And so insulin is not able to play its role in opening up these channels to allow glucose to come in. The effective of all of that is whether you have type 1 or type 2, you're just not getting glucose into the cells. Now, in the US, 95% of the people with diabetes or diabetes mellitus, that's why it's called DM, have the type 2 or what used to be called adult diabetes to separate it from the old term, which was juvenile diabetes. Now that's called type 1. Just to remind you, that sleep is essential for metabolic health. And definitely, if there's insufficient sleep, you can see all of the destabilization of glucose metabolism, insulin resistance is increased appetite and obesity, and of course, diabetes and increased incidence of cardiovascular disease, not even talking about all of the other issues that insufficient sleep can cause. And I'm going to mention in a moment why I'm talking about sleep and diabetes, but just remember, poor sleep, it affects diabetes directly and indirectly because it can trigger changes to the hormones which contribute to weight gain and obesity. Sleep disruption, in fact, increases the risk for type 2 diabetes. And those with type 2, those sufferers are much more likely to have any number of problems like obstructive sleep apnea, other sleep disorders, etc. And when you have short sleep, which is a risk in older people, if there's insufficient sleep, they are 2 times more likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Why am I mentioning this? Remember melatonin. Just keep that in mind, and we will discuss that in a few moments. Remember the causes of high fasting and non-fasting insulin. In the case of fasting, you'll see this with people who are obese, that have a very inactive lifestyle. Their diet is high in carbohydrates. They have diabetes, especially gestational diabetes when babies are born, etc. Those with various types of liver problems, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and those with PCOS, women with polycystic ovary syndrome, will have a tendency to have high fasting insulin, those with a family history of diabetes, and of course, those who are smoking, especially with high levels of smoking. Those with high non-fasting insulin, well, number one would be insulin resistance, simply because glucose is not getting into the cells and insulin is also building up in the blood. Obesity, a sedentary lifestyle, those with high blood pressure and abnormally high cholesterol, and of course, those with sleep apnea. Many of you are familiar with what you would see with various random blood sugar testing, which is the way in which normally you would be testing for insulin, etc. And you will see that the A1C, which is the classic test today, or what's known as hemoglobin A1C, it measures, for those of you who want to be reminded again, the average blood sugar level over a period of the last 2 or 3 months prior to taking that test. It also tells you the amount of hemoglobin that has glucose actually attached to it. So today, the A1C test is the one that you normally will see to test for blood sugar levels. And normally it is below 5.7. And you can see as you go from pre-diabetes to diabetes, it goes up. And here I'm showing all of the other types of testing. You test for fasting blood sugar or glucose tolerance testing, etc. Today, these are the tests that are normally done in blood, but that's not what we're going to be stressing today. What we're going to be looking at is other ways to test for insulin and blood sugar levels. And so, if you want to test for any type of analyte and you want to test for it in a particular medium in blood or other than blood, you need to have three things. Number one, the procurement of the sample has to be simple. You've got to have a simple and inexpensive way of doing a test with minimal discomfort. Number two, if you're going to test for a particular analyte in a particular medium, it has to be very specific. It must associate itself to a state of health or disease. That biomarker can't be general, it has to be pretty specific. And the technology needs to be accurate, needs to be portable, easy to use. And so, for all these three major things, saliva has been shown for decades now as a biomedium that fulfills all these three prerequisites. And so, having said that, let's immediately go and look at the correlation of glucose in blood and saliva. For example, in a fasting state, for healthy subjects, it is now well understood, many studies on this, that there is a linear correlation of glucose in blood and saliva. Very linear correlation. So, although the various values can be highly individual from person to person, you get a good correlation in pre and in 2 hours after glucose intake. You take in glucose into the body, you're going to see a pretty good correlation. So, in the case of this particular study by Zhang et al., they said, yeah, saliva can be an alternative, non invasive diagnostic method for testing for diabetes, for example. Now, when you do the test, when you do this particular saliva test, the advanced stress and hormone profile, in the kit, you actually have a paper. And this is what the paper is. It's a carbohydrate challenge test. And what is that? Well, you want to assess non-fasting insulin as well as fasting. But in the case of non-fasting, how do you test for that? Well, you have to challenge the body with a carbohydrate amount that gets into the body. This is another way of looking at an oral glucose tolerance test. What do? You ingest 75 grams of carbohydrate as part of a meal that may contain fats and proteins. And this list, each one of these lists, breads and grains, fruits, starches, each one of them gives 15 grams of carbohydrate. And so you've got to combine 5 of these in a meal that you take 1 hour before you do the saliva test at noon. And that's going to test to see what is going on with non-fasting insulin. And one of the things it's able to screen for is insulin resistance. Since in order to determine an insulin response, you have to ingest a meal with carbohydrate. You're stressing the system with carbohydrate in order to be able to see what happens an hour later. So we're looking here at a correlation of salivary and serum insulin. And on the left, you see what happens with fasting insulin. Is there a correlation? And there sure is. It's very linear. What about insulin levels in saliva and serum when you have actually stressed the system with that carbohydrate challenge? Just as a point of interest, we look at fasting insulin in the morning when you haven't had anything to eat yet. At noon hour, which is the second time you take saliva, you now will stress the system. In blood, you would see a change immediately. In saliva, you would have to wait about 45 minutes to an hour. And sure enough, if you've done that carbohydrate challenge, an hour later, you're going to start seeing a rise in insulin levels in saliva. Remember, it takes more time. It's got to go through the blood, it's got to get into the tissues, it's got to go through the salivary glands to eventually get into the saliva, but it will. And so elevated fasting insulin or insulin dysregulation after glucose ingestion, in either case, these are hallmarks of insulin resistance. And so after you do all of these studies, you're able to really come up with reference ranges. Reference ranges not just for classic serum or blood testing, but also for saliva. So remember, the message here is you can test accurately for insulin in saliva and serum. The saliva levels of serum of insulin are much less than they are in serum, but you are seeing them accurately. In fact, salivary insulin concentrations are 10 times lower than they are in serum, but they are there and they are quite accurate, which therefore supports this potential of saliva, as this study said, as a biomarker, not just for non-diagnostic testing, but you can actually use it for diagnostic testing for type 2 diabetes. That's how accurate it is. Well, having said that about insulin, and I took you on a very, very short tour of insulin, what about the relationship of insulin and cortisol? Well, what you need to know is that cortisol is a potent insulin antagonistic hormone. What does that mean? That cortisol inhibits insulin secretion, its release, and its signaling. In fact, it reduces GLP-1 production. Now, cortisol increases blood glucose by inducing key gluconeogenic enzymes, where, number one, in the liver, it increases hepatic glucose production. It stimulates, in fact, glucagon secretion, which is the opposite of what insulin would do. In muscle, it reduces the translocation of GLUT4. GLUT4 is a particular entity in a cell which allows insulin ultimately to open up the channel for glucose to get into cells. Well, in what cortisol does is it reduces the ability of GLUT4 to actually function. And ultimately, what that does is it impairs, it decreases glucose uptake by the cell. And remember, I told you that is a sign of insulin resistance. And in fat, lipolytic activity, the breakdown of fats and so on, increases the amount of circulating free fatty acid. And that is another sign of insulin resistance. So all of that says that cortisol counters insulin. So let's go through that. Here is a typical cortisol insulin connection. The normal cortisol effect is there to act in acute stress. If you have acute stress, you prepare for fight or flight, right? Am I going to fight with the lion or the tiger coming at me, or am I going to run away as fast as I can? What do the adrenals do? They secrete cortisol. What does that do? It taps the various glucose entities lying in the liver. It says to the liver, start producing glucose and taking glucagon to change into glucose. Why? We want to increase glucose to get it into the muscles. Because if you're going to run away, if you're going to fight, those muscles need to be working. It also inhibits insulin because it wants to prevent storage of glucose. All that glucose needs to be used by the muscles for fighting or flight. But eventually, what happens is the arteries narrow because of epinephrine in order to either fight or run, and that will resolve the situation and the hormone levels normalize. That's the way it should work. But what happens if there's chronic stress? If there's chronic stress, there's ongoing elevated cortisol. It just doesn't stop. So, with chronic stress, yes, you are tapping the proteins, you are getting the liver to produce glucose. The adrenals are hyper secreting cortisol because the stress doesn't stop. So, on top of everything that's going on in the liver, you are increasing blood glucose. You're actually suppressing adiponectin. And for those of you who don't remember, adiponectin is a very strong hormone that normally increases insulin sensitivity to allow glucose to get into the cells. But here, it's not allowing them into the cells. It's inhibiting insulin. It inhibits glucose from entering into the cell and being used. In other words, the cells become very insulin resistant. If they're insulin resistant, the blood glucose level remains high. The pancreas sees high glucose, it continues to produce insulin because of the high glucose. And that's a vicious cycle that eventually will lead to prediabetes or frank diabetes type 2. Just a reminder, insulin and melatonin. Melatonin generally inhibits insulin secretion. It inhibits insulin secretion. And it has a relationship, which is a key part of the circadian regulation of glucose. And remember that I told you earlier about the melatonin effect and how it affects insulin. Well, melatonin has a signaling system that is syncing insulin secretion to the natural sleep and wake cycles. But if you're getting insufficient sleep, if you're beginning to really create a problem in the 24-hour system, that is a problem. In the case of insulin and the sex hormones, there is an interaction. What is the impact of insulin on sex hormones? Well, one of the things is hyperinsulinemia, meaning a large amount of insulin in the blood, often seen in insulin resistance, that stimulates the ovaries to produce greater amounts of testosterone. And with obesity, it's a major risk factor for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. It impacts the sex hormone levels. So, for example, in males who are obese, they have lower testosterone and they have higher estradiol levels. In the case of sex hormone binding globulin, the SHBG, insulin levels are negatively correlated with SHBG. You lower SHBD levels and you increase the amount of free active hormone because normally SHBG is binding those hormones. If they are now much greater amounts in the free state, that affects insulin sensitivity and metabolic health. And vice versa. How about sex hormones and their effect on insulin? Well, estrogens, E2, for example, improves insulin sensitivity in both males and females. Testosterone, it improves insulin sensitivity, particularly in males, of course, with higher levels of testosterone. And progesterone, unlike the estrogens and testosterone, progesterone impairs or decreases insulin sensitivity. And so I took you on a whirlwind tour today of number 5, the metabolic profile. In the first 2 lectures that we gave on this, we went through the other 4. You may want to look at those again to get a general idea of this very powerful profile, which brings together stress, sex hormones, mucosal immune function, antioxidation and circadian rhythm, and of course, metabolic profile. And to end, I'm going to just look at a case study to give you some idea of some of the clinical effects of chronic stress, because that's why we're trying to do this to show you how these interrelate. So let's look at John. John is a 40-year-old male. He's a construction worker. He's having increasing stress at work and home. He is, in fact, suffering from extreme fatigue. That's what he says. He's having trouble sleeping, which for him has been and is very unusual. Recently, he was at his GP, and the blood tests that were done showed high blood pressure and high cholesterol. He's gaining weight. In fact, he was told he was becoming obese. He has a BMI. This is a body mass index. It's not exact, but it's a pretty good way of looking at obesity. The BMI is 28. For those of you unfamiliar with it, if you have a BMI which is greater than 30, it is conventionally considered that you are now in the level of obesity. And recently, he has started to notice darkening skin patches developing on the neck, which has traditionally been called acanthosis nigricans. And he's been told by his GP that he has a number of signs of what the GP called insulin resistance. He has high blood glucose, increasing weight, hunger and thirst. He's very fatigued. He's even begun to get tingling in his feet. And of course, he has those skin patches. And the GPs encouraged him to improve his condition by losing weight. So now John is at the nutritionist seeking help in developing a dietary plan. And he even reveals that apart from his obesity and his cardiovascular issues, recently he started to develop GI problems. He says, I have problems in my intestine. The nutritionist recognizes that to develop a plan of action here, you need to get at the root cause or maybe causes of John's problems. And what effect in this case is chronic stress having on his insulin and his GI function, and the already evident consequences, which I just explained to you. So the nutritionist begins with a salivary screening test. This test we're calling the advanced stress and hormone profile to relate the function of the adrenals, the cortisol, to the sex hormones, to antioxidation and circadian disruption, melatonin, to immune function, the sIgA, and of course the metabolic or insulin functions. And here is John's report. And we see here the very high cortisol levels throughout the day because we're looking at 4 cortisols. As a reminder, right? It's morning, noon, afternoon, and night. These are all above the reference range. And the DHEA is beginning to go up as well. And what we're seeing is significant increases in both fasting and non-fasting insulin, which you get on the report. You notice the fasting is 17. You get to elevate it from 18 and up. So this individual, John, is really getting to an elevated state in when he is getting his fasting insulin in the morning. That is not a good sign. That is a sign of insulin resistance. And of course, in the non-fasting state, from the noon sample, he is at 33, he's already elevated. So all of that is not a good sign. The sIgA levels are very low. And why? Well, one of the things you'll see from one of the other lectures is when you get high cortisol levels, mostly due to high chronic stress, that will affect the immunoglobulin function in the mucosa, in this case of the intestine, And which one are we talking about? Secretory IgA. That is not a good sign because what that creates is a whole number of GI issues, which we're not going to go into today. We did in one of the other lectures. Melatonin is above the normal daytime range. Why would that be? Well, I alluded to that earlier because this gentleman's circadian rhythm is now very dysfunctional. It's very hard to know whether he has been getting decent sleep during the night. He says he hasn't. He may now have a circadian rhythm which is completely dysfunctional. That needs to be uh, really dealt with very quickly. And his testosterone level is actually quite low for someone of the age of 40. All of this, all of these results are really red flags that are telling you that there is a chronic stress problem, all from this one non diagnostic screening profile. So, what would be the plan of action? Well, it's pretty clear stress management in its various forms. He has to decrease the weight, of course. He has to do various things to aid in the recovery of the sIgA levels in the gut. And we can spend another lecture going through all of the different modalities in the way in which you can do that. He needs to regulate the sleep wake cycle. And in doing all of that, consequently, be able to help in the recovery of a balanced insulin function. That's what should happen. And so that was just a quick overview of insulin with a case report. And that's it.
Dr. Gonshore, thank you so much for that. I'm just amazed at how this stress and hormone panel has evolved over the years. We used to love it in the health coaching and nutrition and fitness world because it gave us insights into our client and their condition, their true condition, more than we could possibly get any other way. Saliva testing, as you said, is very, very accurate. It's inexpensive. It's easy to ship. I know that Fluids IQ ships around the world, and we're thankful of that because we have FDN practitioners, probably in 50 countries now. But the test has been, again, flagship, foundational. Knowing, the catabolic versus anabolic state, knowing what's going on with the circadian rhythm, again, with the four cortisols. And then we added at some point along the line the melatonin, and even better look at the circadian rhythm as well as antioxidant level and that sort of a thing. I think it's a window into gut function because most melatonin is made in the gut. A lot from the pineal gland, of course, at nighttime, but and then adding secretory IgA gave us another point in this constellation of healing opportunities that we're looking for. And so I think it was one of the best tests we had. And now we've made it even better with the insulin. So it's really quite a remarkable amount of information covering everything from the circadian rhythm, the sex hormones. You've got melatonin in the sleep. You've got secretory IgA in the immune system and inflammation and things like that. You've got now the insulin. So there's a ton of data there. Again, I always like to use the word healing opportunities, which guide your therapy. They also keep the client on track, because you can always sort of dangle those numbers, and they really do mean something. These are not to be ignored. The idea that you might be, or that you are pre-diabetic, yeah, and everyone knows that they don't want to be diabetic these days. Besides the fact that they're already overweight and tired and fatigued and low libido and brain fog and all the other things that go along with this kind of condition. It doesn't have to be as bad as the sort of diagnosed metabolic syndrome. You're on your way. I love this kind of testing because it's subclinical, is often the term. used. And that allows us to use it for anti-aging, longevity, as well as, getting to the heart of a condition and getting a person to turn their health around. So it's absolutely amazing. And we appreciate everything you've done, Dr. Gonshore, in the world of testing and making it easy on us practitioners who want to put the proper tools, the proper data in the hands of our clients. And so thank you again.
It's a pleasure, and we will see each other very soon to continue to look at these wonderful tests.